Otis stared at the brown patch above his bed. It looked vaguely like a state. Texas, maybe. It was not black mold, not the horror story kind that makes a person pack a bag and call the city. It was more like damp surface mildew, the kind old buildings collect when the ceiling sweats through a cold week, and the landlord pretends not to understand what moisture is. His landlord, a man named Pat who fixed nothing and apologized for everything, had told him to wipe it with vinegar for now. Then he had promised, in the tired voice of a man who promised everything by accident, that he would send someone to look at the roof. Soon. Otis climbed onto a wobbly chair, sprayed the vinegar, and started scrubbing. His arms ached. The smell stung his eyes. The radiator behind him knocked twice, then quit. And for the first time in nearly a year, something ugly did not make him feel poor. It made him feel strangely free. He climbed off the chair, sat down on the cold linoleum floor of his strange, ugly little apartment, and laughed out loud. There was no one around to hear him. There was no view to photograph. Nothing in this room could possibly impress anyone he had ever met. He pressed his palm flat against the cold floor and could feel the whole crooked building vibrating from a truck passing on 82nd. He didn't move for a while. 11 months earlier, Otis lived in a 600-square-foot studio in Portland's Pearl District. The building had a rooftop deck with a fire pit nobody actually used. The lobby had a wall of preserved moss, lit from behind so it glowed like a museum exhibit. His rent was $2,400 a month, and he made about $3,800 after taxes. From his job as a marketing coordinator at a software company nobody outside of tech had heard of. His friends called the place a steal. His mother called it impressive. His Instagram followers called it goals. Otis called it home, even though, if he was honest with himself, he had never once felt at home there. He had an espresso machine that always clogged, an $1,900 credenza he bought because a podcaster had one, and a leather chair that wrecked his back. Savings? Zero. Just $9,200 in credit card debt, shuffled around like a bad magic trick. Things finally snapped in April. He was on a date at a coffee shop in the West End, sitting across from a designer named Hannah who had a half-shaved head and a laugh he liked. He ordered them 2 flat whites and a slice of banana bread to share. He handed over his card. The barista swiped it, looked up, tried it again, cleared her throat. "Sir, it's declined." He pulled out a second card, too quickly, with the kind of smile people use when they are trying to convince strangers that nothing is wrong. That one declined too. It was not a mystery, not really. The balance had been sitting close to the limit for weeks, and the coffee charge must have pushed it over. The third card should have worked. At least, that was what Otis told himself in the 3 seconds before the machine rejected it. Later, standing alone in his apartment, he would see the fraud alert on his phone. After 2 failed attempts, the bank had frozen the transaction and asked him to confirm it by text. But at the counter, with Hannah watching, and the barista holding his card between 2 fingers, all Otis understood was this: every version of his life had just failed in public. Hannah, to her credit, didn't make a face. She took out her own card and paid for the coffees, and said something gentle about how those card readers were always glitching. They sat down. They talked about her dog. They talked about her cousin's wedding. They talked about a band neither of them really liked. But Otis wasn't there. He zoned out entirely. He nodded along while she talked, but his brain had completely shut off. After the date, he walked the long way home, 20 blocks, with a detour east down to Waterfront Park so he could see the river. He did not take his phone out of his pocket. He did not check his email. He just walked, and at one point he stood at the seawall above the dark water of the Willamette, and he thought about how stupid the moss wall in his lobby was. The next morning at work, he sat in the kitchen waiting for the bad office coffee to brew, and a woman named Colleen sat down across from him. Colleen was 46, a senior copywriter, and she wore the same 3 sweaters in rotation. She had once told Otis she spent most of her 20s and 30s in roommate houses, basement units, and places nobody photographed for the internet. He had laughed at her then. He didn't laugh now. "You look terrible," she said. "Thanks. What happened?" He didn't mean to tell her. But the espresso machine he could not work, and the leather chair he could not sit in, and the moss wall, and the declined cards, and the long walk home, and the river. All of it came out, in a kitchen, before the coffee was even ready. Colleen listened. She didn't interrupt. When he was done, she pulled out a napkin from the stack by the toaster and wrote down 2 numbers. The first number was the rent in his neighborhood, roughly $2,400. The second number was the rent in a neighborhood he had never considered, $895. "There's a building on 82nd Avenue, she said. "It's ugly. The fridge sounds like a bad fan. There's a Vietnamese grocery store next door and a tire shop across the street. My nephew lived there for 2 years. He came out okay. Try contacting them to see if it's still available for rent. I can't live on 82nd. Why not?" He opened his mouth. Then he closed it. He couldn't say it out loud. He could barely think it. Nobody he knew lived on 82nd. None of his photos would look the way he wanted them to look. And though he hadn't let himself notice it until that moment in a fluorescent-lit kitchen, he had spent the last 4 years renting an image, not a home. Colleen pushed the napkin across the table. "You're renting a place to live," she said, "or you're renting a place to be admired. You can't do both on what they pay us." It took him 3 weeks to call the number on the napkin. The woman who picked up was named Roxana. She was not the landlord. Exactly. She was the property manager, which meant she collected applications, answered calls, and apologized for Pat before Pat had even done anything wrong. Her voice sounded like a person who had spent her entire adult life on hold with utility companies. She told him the apartment was available. She told him to come see it. She told him not to wear anything nice. The building was the color of old newspaper. The elevator had a sign that said, "Out of order since November," and the date had been crossed out 3 times. The place had no parking. He had to haul laundry down the block, and the only window stared straight into a brick wall. The hallway smelled like cumin and bleach, in roughly equal parts. Unit 4C was not really a studio so much as a room that had made a deal with the kitchen sink. The bathroom door did not fully close. The single window looked out at the side of another building. The kitchen counter had a chip in the shape of a question mark. The fridge sounded like a bad fan. The rent was $8.95. Water and heat were included. He would pay his own electric. The lease was month to month, mostly because people did not stay there long enough for Pat to ask for anything else. Otis signed it on a Tuesday and cried at the bus stop for 15 minutes afterward. He could not tell if the tears were shame or relief, and after a while he decided they were both, which he supposed was the same thing. Moving day was a small disaster. The espresso machine went on Facebook Marketplace for $100 to a guy who looked disappointed in him. The credenza went for $420 to a woman who measured every inch of it twice. The leather chair went for free to a college student named Mike who came in a borrowed pickup and called Otis Sir 5 times and made him feel ancient. Most of the money disappeared immediately. First month's rent, a small deposit, a rented van, a few cleaning supplies. The kind of boring expenses that do not make a good story, but decide whether a person survives the first 30 days of a new life. Still, when it was over, he had not added another $1 to the cards. That, by itself, felt like a miracle. By the time he closed the door of 4C behind him, he had 2 suitcases of clothes, a mattress on the floor, a desk chair from a thrift store, a saucepan, 3 books, and his laptop. The fridge hummed in that low, broken way. The radiator knocked. Somewhere down the hallway, a man was singing a song in a language Otis could not place, and the singer sounded happy in a way Otis had not been in years. For the first time since he had moved to Portland, Otis could afford his own life. The apartment did not fix his life. It simply stopped his life from leaking faster than he could repair it. The first month was hard in ways he had not expected. He kept walking into the kitchen, expecting to make a coffee, only to remember he'd sold the machine. He saw his own apartment through the eyes of people who would never visit it. He turned down 2 dinners because he didn't want anyone to ask him where he lived now. But the bank account stopped bleeding. In the first month, after rent and electric and groceries and transit, he had $940 left before debt payments. He stared at the number in his banking app for so long that his phone screen went black, and when he tapped it awake, the number was still there. It had not been a dream. The minimums on all 3 cards ate a little over $200. In the old apartment, that would have ruined him for the week. Here, for the first time, it did not. He sent another $650 toward the smallest balance and left the rest alone. Having a few hundred extra bucks in the bank finally let him breathe. By month 3, the smallest card was gone. The second one died in month 6, helped along by a tax refund he did not spend, and a few $100s left from selling the last pieces of the Pearl District version of himself. The third one, the bigger one with the higher interest rate, took until month 9 to finish off. The interest charges fell off his statements one by one. He stopped doing the math in his head on the bus to work. Around month 4, he caught himself eating a whole bowl of pho without checking his phone, and realized he hadn't had heartburn in 2 weeks. he just lost interest in updating his Instagram. His friend group thinned out, though not because they abandoned him. The group chats still pinged with invites to $20 cocktail nights and $100 dinners, but Otis started saying no. He no longer wanted to split bills he couldn't afford. The drift was natural, born from a shift in priorities rather than geography. The people who only wanted to meet at rooftop bars eventually stopped asking. The ones who were happy to grab a cheap coffee and walk 20 blocks with him stayed. There were fewer of them than he had thought, and that, on its own, was a strange kind of gift. He found a Vietnamese place downstairs that did a $10 pho and a coffee that was, somehow, the best coffee he had ever drunk in his life. He started going there every Saturday morning. The owner, an older man named Bao, learned his name by the third visit. By the eighth, Bao introduced him to his grandson, a kid named Henry who was messing around with podcast editing and wanted to know if Otis, being in marketing, had any tips. Otis had no tips, but he had a laptop and he had empty evenings. Inspired by the kid's questions, Otis started watching YouTube tutorials on audio engineering. At first, he wasn't trying to start a business. He just needed something to do in the evenings that did not involve scrolling through apartments he could no longer afford, or people he was trying not to envy. He practiced by cleaning up Henry's messy audio files, removing background hiss, cutting long pauses, leveling voices that jumped from whisper to shout. Most of it was tedious. All of it was strangely calming. His marketing job helped more than he expected. He already knew how to write a clean message, how to make a service sound useful without making it sound desperate, and how to answer a client without sounding like a person begging to be chosen. The skill he had been selling for other people, badly paid and mostly unnoticed, finally started working for him. By month 7, after hundreds of hours of self-teaching, Otis landed his first 2 paying clients on a freelance site. They were tiny jobs: podcast cleanup, intro edits, a noisy interview recorded in a kitchen with a refrigerator roaring in the background. But the clients paid. More importantly, they came back. By month 9, he had 4 regular clients. By month 11, the side gig was bringing in roughly $1,200 a month. He did not tell anyone at work. He did not put it on his resume. He just let the income grow quietly, and once the final credit card was dead, he funneled nearly all of it straight into a savings account. And then, in month 11, the brown patch appeared on his ceiling. Pat called it mildew. Otis called it rent control, having a sense of humor. Roxana told him, in writing this time, that someone would check the roof before the next rain. Otis did not fully believe her, but he appreciated the email. Old Otis would have spiraled. Old Otis would have seen the stain and thought, "This is proof I failed." New Otis got the vinegar, climbed onto the wobbly chair, and scrubbed. When he climbed down, he sat on the cold linoleum floor and opened his banking app one more time. $4,400 in savings, built over the last 2 months after killing the final credit card. From the money his old rent used to swallow, the interest he no longer owed, and the first steady checks from the freelance work. He was clear of debt. He had a few steady clients, cheap rent, good foe nearby, and a kid bugging him about audio settings. It was enough. A few weeks later, Otis walked up to Colleen in the office kitchen. She was wearing one of her 3 familiar sweaters, waiting for the bad office coffee to brew, just like she had 11 months ago. He asked if he could buy her dinner. A real one, not something from the break room vending machine. He told her it was to say thank you for the napkin. She looked at him, studying his face for a moment, then smiled. "Only if it's not in the pearl," she said. They went to a solid, low-lit steakhouse a few miles east of the office. They talked about her nephew, the one who used to live on 82nd. They talked about work. They didn't talk about moss walls or Danish credenzas. When the check came, Otis took it. He pulled out one card. The waitress took it away and brought back the receipt a minute later. It went through on the first swipe. That evening, he took the bus back and walked the rest of the way to 4C, past the tire shop and the Vietnamese grocery and the dry cleaner with the broken sign. He let himself into a building that smelled like cumin and bleach. The radiator knocked. The fridge hummed. The ceiling looked clean for now. He fell asleep with one sock still on. He didn't wake up until the garbage truck came at 6. Otis doesn't talk about that year much. When people ask him why he moved out of the Pearl District, he shrugs and says the rent was killing him, and most people nod and let it go. Sometimes, late at night, with a friend who actually wants to listen, he says more than that. He says he used to think a nice apartment was a reward for working hard. He doesn't think that anymore. He realized he'd been paying a massive premium just to convince other people he was successful. The people who looked good on his feed 4 years ago, he sees them sometimes, on the train, in building lobby photos, in little flashes of a life he used to want. Maybe some of them are doing fine. Maybe some of them were always better at affording the image than he was. But sometimes he hears the old jokes. Someone rotating cards. Someone waiting for payday. Someone calling a $400 weekend self-care in a voice that sounds too much like his own used to sound. And when he hears it, he does not feel superior. He feels lucky he got embarrassed early enough to change. The fridge still hums. The radiator still knocks. He runs the vinegar over the ceiling once a month, just to be safe. The savings number keeps climbing, slower than he would like, faster than he ever thought it could.